Welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles legal issues, bringing you information analysis. My name is Dumile Mateza. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by tweeting us at Rights Recourse or calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Alternatively, email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. South Africa's ruling party, the ANC, has hinted the country's intention to pull out of the International Criminal Court. This comes after a barrage of international criticism leveled against Pretoria for allowing Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir to leave the country despite an international court warrant of arrest. Bashir managed to sneak out of the country despite a high court order for him not to leave. What would be the implications of South Africa's withdrawal from the ICC, and how will this affect the rest of the continent's human rights record? Well, that's what we are discussing on Rights and Recourse today. To unpack today's topic, we would like to welcome in the studio Ms. Angela Mudukuti, a legal expert from the International Criminal Justice Program at the Southern African Litigation Center. And at our Pretoria studio, we are joined by Ms. Otilia Maunganidze, who is a senior researcher from the Institute of Security Studies. Ladies, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us.
Good afternoon.
Probably let me ask this question to you, Angela, first. The decision of the ANC at its National General Council for South Africa to withdraw its membership of the ICC was not surprising. It was confirmation of long-held views within the alliance. However, what does this mean for our human rights record, policy and as a liberation movement before we became a political party, before the ANC became a political party?
I think it's a devastating blow to South Africa's position on human rights previously, because let's not forget apartheid is an international crime. And for South Africa to withdraw from the only international accountability mechanism is a big disappointment, and it almost reflects a lack of respect for the principles that have brought us through apartheid: human rights, human dignity, and equality before the law. So I think it is a significant blow.
Do you want to weigh in there, Otilia?
Indeed, I agree with Angela's assessment in terms of what it means for human rights, not just internationally, but also domestically here in South Africa in terms of responding to some of the most serious crimes known to mankind.
The other question is, if our policy, our human rights policy, the principles with which our foreign policy is based on human rights, and now we are saying we are going to withdraw from the International Criminal Court, which is seized with adjudicating over human rights abuses. What does it tell us? Where are we going? Otilia, do you want to take a first bite of that?
Oh, definitely. I think one of the key issues that comes out of this announcement that the ANC wants to push for withdrawal is that it does move against what the ANC as well as the rest of South African government have been pushing for over 21 years before the overthrow of apartheid and post-apartheid.
Let me come back to you. I will stay with you, Otilia. What is the difference between this court and the court that heard the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War?
The difference between the Nuremberg Tribunal, together with the courts in the Far East, which dealt with the crimes from Tokyo, together with the crimes from Germany, is that those were created specifically to deal with crimes that had happened during World War. They were as a result of the Allied forces creating those courts to deal with people who they had regarded to be most responsible for the World War. But uniquely, the Nuremberg Tribunal, as well as the Tokyo Tribunal, only dealt with the Japanese and the German forces, and they didn't deal with all sides to the conflict. On the flip side, the International Criminal Court is a treaty body established by United Nations member states but also which is a treaty of voluntary association. To date, 123 countries have ratified the Rome Statute, 34 of those being African countries. And so those countries have said, we support an institution that will deal with international crimes, and we will subsume ourselves to that court's jurisdiction, but quite importantly that we will also ensure that domestically we deal with these crimes ourselves.
The other question, of course, is we've had several other trials in Africa, in Rwanda and Tanzania. How different were those courts to the ICC?
Those courts are different in the sense that they are hybrid courts. The International Criminal Court is not a hybrid court, and those courts had a very specific mandate, very specific jurisdiction, and were also limited in terms of the time in which they would exist. The International Criminal Court is a permanent court. The Tribunal for Rwanda, Special Tribunal for Sierra Leone, those are all temporary courts for a specific conflict, and once their mandate is over, those courts will no longer exist. So they are different in nature and different in the way that they're constructed.
Apparently also, these courts, some of these courts, were actually used, especially the Charles Taylor case, was actually for the Sierra Leone, special court for the Sierra Leone case. But Charles Taylor, in the case of Charles Taylor, there's been this criticism that the court is targeting African leaders. We're going to stay with that part going into the break, but what I wanted to know is, it would seem to me that it is African leaders who actually handed over Charles Taylor to the ICC.
Well, this is the difference. Charles Taylor went to the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which is different from the International Criminal Court. So that would be a completely separate situation. This criticism of the ICC targeting Africa is leveled against the ICC for its current cases. For example, the case against President Omar al-Bashir, the case against President, well, now it's been dropped, the case against President of Kenya and the Deputy President William Ruto of Kenya as well. So that specific criticism is for the docket that is before the ICC now, where all its cases are in fact African cases. But as I always say, that criticism is unfair and not justified. I think anyone who understands the international criminal justice system will realize that 70% of the cases before the court are what we call self-referrals, where autonomous independent governments have asked the ICC to intervene, and the ICC has done so. There are 2 United Nations Security Council referrals, that's the situation of Libya and Sudan, and there is one instance where the prosecutor exercised his jurisdiction proprio motu, of his own volition, and that's the situation in Kenya. And even then, the Kenyan government was given a chance to adjudicate these crimes and was unable to handle the crimes against humanity and the post-election violence. So the ICC system is based on a system of cooperation, and we see it's Africans making use of the court they created. There would be no ICC now if it wasn't for the African states.
Let me stay with you, because we seem to be having a problem with Pretoria. Let me stay with you. You mentioned the case against William Ruto, Deputy President William Ruto and President Uhuru Kenyatta. Was it, I seem to remember, in the case of Kenya, Kofi Annan was put together a report. Are these charges against President Uhuru Kenyatta and Deputy President William Ruto based on that report?
The report the charges are based on is the Waki Commission report.
Or the Waki Commission?
Correct, yes. So there was a commission of inquiry established, and from that commission, they identified people they felt were perhaps the most responsible on both sides of the political divide. And from then, the ICC conducted its own investigations. And from the ICC investigations, they indicted several members of the Kenyan government.
There is something else. I just want to stay with you here, because I see that Pretoria is still not ready. Many people have said for many years the ICC, we know the ICC is a new body of the United Nations, but for many years crimes against human rights abuses in Israel have not been investigated.
And this is true, and that's because the ICC didn't have the necessary jurisdiction. Palestine has recently signed and ratified the Rome Statute, giving the ICC jurisdiction for crimes perpetrated as of the date of signature and ratification. And so things could change. But in the past, the ICC simply did not have the jurisdiction to enter into that conflict. And now it does, so we have to see what comes from that preliminary examination.
Earlier, quickly, Ottilia made reference to the court sitting in Tokyo, in Japan. And it would seem to be even then, as far as that, the Americans were absolved because they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima.
Yes, I think historically there has been a lot of victor's justice, if you can call it that, but I think this is why the ICC stands apart from that, because it is not designed in the same way. It's designed to distribute justice fairly and equally, and that's what it's seeking to do. It has its political issues. For example, the United Nations Security Council referral is a politically contentious one, because obviously the 5 permanent powers would not refer themselves and often veto situations that don't suit their geopolitical agenda, and so there is an issue there. But I think substantively the ICC has a mandate to see that justice is done globally. We will continue our discussion here on the process of withdrawal from the ICC. If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Recourse. Stay with us.
Makamelo Sekgontse, one strong woman who said no to hunger. She never allowed circumstances to pull her down. At daybreak, she is up and running in the streets of Johannesburg to make her living. After 12 hours of hard work, she goes back home being able to put food on the table. Join me, Bule Molebatsi, on your show about those who take on and conquer life challenges every Saturday at 5:30.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we discuss the process of withdrawal from the ICC. I'm coming to you, Ottilia, now that you are back with us. What is the process of effecting a withdrawal from the ICC?
Well, the first thing that the ANC would have to do is take this matter to Parliament.
Let's not make reference to the ANC. Let's just talk generally, because I picked up in my research that even the Sudanese had written a letter to Ban Ki-moon asking to withdraw from the ICC.
Except the Sudanese are not a state party to the Rome Statute.
Yes.
And in South Africa, the party that has indicated that they wish to withdraw, whether we like it or not, is the African National Congress. And at the moment, the South African government, together in terms of Parliament, isn't seized of the matter as yet. So in order for South Africa to withdraw, there would have to be, firstly, a motion before Parliament in order to repeal the South African implementation of the Rome Statute Act of 2002. Once that act is repealed, and that would require public consultations, given that it is an act that is considered to be of national interest. After that process, only then can there be a motion to withdraw from the Rome Statute, which is again presented before Parliament to say, now that we've repealed the act, we want to withdraw from the Rome Statute. And after that, the South African government would then submit a letter notifying the United Nations Secretary General of their intention to withdraw. And only after 12 months after submitting that letter would South Africa no longer be a state party to the Rome Statute.
But if you are not a member of the ICC or a signatory to the Rome Statute, does the withdrawing absolve a member from meeting its obligations?
So if you are a state party at the moment, all the obligations that applied to you as a state party would remain as and when you withdraw, particularly in respect of current cases. What that would mean is that after South Africa withdraws, if it does withdraw, it would still have the same obligations it has now. Withdrawal serves a function more in terms of the future than it does of what are current cases. And the second thing is that obviously it has a symbolic effect.
There's a dichotomy here. There seems to be a group of members of the UN who sit in the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council, who are not signatories to the Rome Statute, amongst them Russia, China, and the United States of America, but they can refer cases to the ICC. How so?
This is indeed one of the shortcomings of the international criminal justice system, is that you do have big powers, powerful nations, permanent members of the Security Council, referring situations as and when it suits them. That being said, though, that's not a problem the ICC can resolve. The Assembly of States Parties, the signatories to the Rome Statute, can push for amendments to that effect and can fix this deficit. But currently the states haven't done that. So it is a problem, it is an existing problem, there is a remedy, and the people who, or the nations that can make this change are the signatories themselves, which is why we say South Africa withdrawing from the Rome Statute would be counterproductive, because you can only affect change from within and not from without. And so if South Africa wants to see change with the Rome Statute, they need to mobilize for it, if that is what they would like to do.
Otilia, African countries have been seized with wanting to transform the United Nations up until as recently as the last General Assembly. They were talking about what needs the transformation of the UN, including the United Nations Security Council, and having a permanent member from Africa on the Security Council. How serious will the world take statements of withdrawal from the ICC, take Africa when they want to withdraw from the ICC that deals with human rights?
The first thing, obviously, is around the calls for UN Security Council reform and what that means. But first, before I respond to your question about what it means in terms of Africa as a whole's observation of human rights, is the UN Security Council's mandate in terms of the Rome Statute is under Chapter 6 of the Rome Statute, and it speaks, of the UN Charter, and it speaks quite specifically to acting in the interest of international peace and security. Now, the contestation is whether or not those current member states to the UN Security Council, particularly the permanent members, are acting in that interest. So in reforming the UN Security Council to support international criminal justice, it's not just about having a permanent member that is African, but it is also about reforming the UN Security Council such that countries that are not member states of the Rome Statute do not necessarily dictate which matters from non-member states would go before the before the ICC. So when it comes to an African country being a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it should be viewed through that lens. That if you become a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it shouldn't be so that you can usurp the interests of international peace and security, but rather so that you can promote them. A country that is not a member state of the ICC, therefore becoming a permanent member, would still have us in the position that we are now, where people allege that countries like the United States, China, and Russia are acting against the interests of the ICC by blocking certain referrals while allowing others to go through.
That's a problem. That's the biggest problem here, because some of the biggest human rights abusers, if one may put it so, if one refers to the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and also the Guantanamo Bay situation, where people have been kept without being charged for 15, 20 years. Surely those are the cases that should also be referred to the ICC.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more, but once again, we have to recognize the jurisdictional limits of the ICC. The ICC has no jurisdiction over the US because the US is not a signatory. And there are three ways in which a matter comes before the ICC: a self-referral from a member state, a United Nations Security Council referral, or the prosecutor exercising her jurisdiction in a member state country. America doesn't fall into any of these categories, and they're definitely not going to refer themselves to the ICC. And at the Security Council, they can just block such a referral. So it is definitely a situation that needs to be better assessed.
Otilia, is it true that one of the biggest problems of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council is this issue of blocking anything that they do not like, and then as a result, that whatever has been decided by the United Nations doesn't go forward, doesn't go anywhere?
Indeed, and I think one of the key issues here is whether or not in doing that they're acting in the interest of peace and security. You will recall the most recent attempt to refer a situation to the ICC by the UN Security Council was the current situation ongoing in Syria. And it was China and Russia that blocked that referral. The interesting dynamic there was that the UN General Assembly and a host of countries within the United Nations had pushed for a referral, led by countries like Switzerland and France, who thought it was important for the crimes in Syria to be dealt with. So it's not just the United States which is blocking important referrals, it's also 2 other permanent members that are not party to the Rome Statute. And again, I go back to whether or not blocking is in the interest of peace and security, and I argue that it's not. And so when we speak again about UN Security Council reform, even before we have a permanent member from the African continent, I think what needs to be pushed when it comes to the ICC is that permanent members cannot and do not have the ability to exercise their veto power when it comes to the referral of any country, not just certain countries, to the ICC for prosecution.
Let's take this call from Thabo from Lesotho. Thabo, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Yes, how are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Yes, my question basically is as to the criteria of the cases which can be referred to the ICC. Like here in Lesotho is a signatory to the ICC. So we would like to know which cases can be handled or be referred to Lesotho. If I may make a quick example, we have a case here whereby a former Lesotho Defense Force commander was brutally assassinated. So one would like to know if such a case can be referred to ICC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether we are aware we are au fait with what is happening in Lesotho, both of us. The commission that is being held here, the SADC commission that is being held in Lesotho. And the Thabo's question is, can a case like that be referred to the ICC?
Right, can I respond?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. In order for any case to be referred to the ICC, firstly, the state can do that, or there can be communication even from sort of civil society organizations that wish for the ICC to look into a particular matter. However, the ICC would then only receive a referral if it comes from the state party itself, or as Angela has pointed out, where the prosecutor acts of her own initiative in respect of a state party. Because Lesotho is a state party, the prosecutor can act of her own initiative, or Lesotho itself, or any other state's party, so South Africa, Kenya, any other state party, can refer the situation in Lesotho. However, beyond the communication, there would have to be a test in terms of whether it's admissible. And in that respect, you're looking at whether the crimes being committed in Lesotho fall under the 3 current broad categories of international crimes. So if they're crimes against humanity, they would have to show that there's a systematic, widespread attack on the civilian population. It cannot be sort of one individual having been assassinated, but looking at incidents around that show that crimes against humanity are being committed, or that genocide is being committed, or that they're war crimes. For Lesotho at the moment, because there isn't a conflict, the war crimes would not be possible to refer, but there could be a possibility to refer crimes against humanity.
Did I hear you say there isn't a conflict in Lesotho?
An international or non-international armed conflict as defined in the Geneva Conventions.
Thank you very much.
No.
Thank you very much. The other question, the question that concerns me really, I would like to know is, we have been told several occasions, I think Ottilia repeated that a country that is not a signatory to the Rome Statute cannot be reported to the ICC. Surely there are many countries that are not. For instance, if the ICC is to investigate the Russian invasion of Georgia, then it means Russia will be implicated. But let's keep that for a moment and go to a break. When we come back, we'll answer that question. If you want to be part of this program and do like what Thabo has done, we'll take your calls here. And when we return, if you'd like to join us in today's discussion, as I said, you can call us on 714-549-7, 5498, or you can tweet us at Rights Recourse. Stay with us.
Media Monitor, your weekly media news review program.
It was squashed some few months back, but obviously this is something that is going to hang around Pravin until it is actually dealt with. If he didn't know, then he wasn't doing his job.
In it, she described how the man's hair was frozen, although the man has no hair.
Is anybody volunteering to go to jail for him? That is not how the law works.
This particular matter makes us really look like a serious banana republic.
Unpacking headlines and giving analysis on topical issues. Sundays at 9 a.m. only on the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back. I want to go back to my question to Angela. Angela, earlier I spoke about the investigation into the invasion of Georgia by the Russians. If there's going to be an investigation around that issue, it means it will implicate Russia. And yet Russia is not a signatory to the Rome Statute.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what the investigations turn up. But in that case, then, if the ICC decides that members of the Russian government are the most responsible for the crimes committed in Georgia, then there will be likely to be indictments. And as we see with Sudan, United Nations Security Council referral, non-state party referred, and indictments issued against heads of government of the non-state party. So that's the procedure that it would follow, which is not unusual or unprecedented. It remains to be seen, though, will those leaders appear voluntarily or will they become fugitives of justice? It's a good question.
The other question for me, I want to go back to you, Otilia, around this issue of the Americans. The Americans are refusing to join any United Nations action against another country. In other words, they don't want to be part of the blue hard caps. They want to fight on their own. They don't want to be under the command of somebody else. And they also have not signed the Rome Statute. In other words, there's been vehement opposition to the ICC, especially from the Republican side of the United States government. And how do we deal with that going forward as the United Nations? Because surely Uganda is the most powerful country dictating to the world who and what should be pursued by the ICC.
Yes, and I think the United States decision to go unilaterally in a number of cases has not just been criticized through judicial mechanisms, but quite importantly, it has been criticized by a number of other countries as well. Interestingly, also, one of the countries that has criticized Russia is currently going unilaterally into Syria. They do share one common thing, which is that they're both permanent members of the UN Security Council and also non-member states of the Rome Statute. But when it comes to membership of the Rome Statute, I think the United States present a very interesting case because it was one of the first countries to sign the Rome Statute, and then it unsigned the Rome Statute at a time when they were invading, if you can call it that, Iraq as well as Afghanistan. But with the current government led by Obama, the interesting thing is that they've set up an office of a special envoy that deals specifically with war crimes, who's an extraordinary ambassador to that effect. And one of the issues that they've raised is that while elements within the Democratic Party would want to ratify the Rome Statute, the Senate is largely Republican, and they would need to go through Parliament to do that. And so it raises some of the issues around domestic politics, hugely impacting on international politics, but then also international justice.
One of the biggest issues around the al-Bashir issue was based on immunity and privilege of the president of Sudan. Apparently, going through my research, I found that the ICC has a relationship, a document that they've put together with the EU, where they put out the ground rules as to what will happen in case we want to arrest somebody who has committed war crimes and he falls within the jurisdiction of the EU members. Does the AU not have such an agreement with the ICC? Any of you can answer that question.
Oh, right. The ICC and the AU have been in the past in negotiations to come up with a document similar to the one of the EU. But in fact, the African Union has in many ways moved away from negotiating with the ICC and barred the creation of a liaison office by the ICC to the African Union. So the relationship that the EU and the ICC have, which was a mutual relationship between the two institutions, is failing to be established in Africa, in large part because the African Union don't want to create this liaison office, nor to have a strategic document that deals specifically with some of the issues on both sides of the divide, the ICC and the African Union.
Before we go to another response, let's take this call from Biela from the Free State. Good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Hello. Yes, you're talking to Mr. Biela here.
Yes, Mr. Biela.
Yeah. No, I just wanted a clarity on the point that people are always talking about. The point of the former president of U.S. who attacked Saddam Hussein up until he was executed. How come he wasn't taken to ICC? Which procedure was required for him to go there? I do not know whether you have discussed this issue maybe earlier on, because I just opened the Rights and Recourse now. So maybe if I can get a clarity on that issue, because people are always talking about it, and the big people like President Mugabe is always mentioning it, but it's not clear how come he wasn't taken there.
Fiala, thank you very much for your question. We have touched on that because America is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, but early this week we saw, so I don't know whether you read the stories around Tony Blair making statements about the attack on Iraq. Why was Tony Blair, or I think the UK is a signatory to the Rome Statute, why was Tony Blair not taken to the ICC? Let's probably stick to that, because we know the reasons why George W. Bush was not taken to the ICC.
Well, first of all, Tony Blair, so the ICC did investigate situations in Iraq and closed that investigation because there was insufficient evidence to proceed. But they have currently reopened the investigations and are investigating British troops and their conduct in Iraq. And so who knows what could come from that. And I think it's a process we should monitor very, very closely. But previously, there was insufficient evidence for them to proceed.
And if I can just add on to that. So the ICC is intended to be a court of last resort that should only act where a state is unable and or unwilling to deal with cases related to international crimes committed in a particular situation. What the United Kingdom did was they set up a variety of commissions of inquiry, as well as prosecution domestically of British soldiers themselves who were implicated in some of the conduct. And those were considered in many respects to have been free and fair processes. Of course, then the question goes as to why Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was not indicted, particularly because now, as you've rightly pointed out, he recently expressed regret in going into both Afghanistan and Iraq, but also regret on the actions of the troops of the Allied forces, if I can call them that, in the two countries. So it's a wait and see as to what happens in light of these revelations from Tony Blair himself.
Well, we apologise from the sound coming out of Pretoria, but we can hear the rest of what Ottilia is trying to say, but we'll have to bear with us with regard to that. The other question I want to come to with regard to this issue, Angela, Ottilia mentioned earlier, it also depends on the prosecutor whether he wants to press charges in a certain jurisdiction. One of the criticism of Ms. Bensouda is that she's not as flamboyant as Oreno Ocampo, who was criticized for being flamboyant in a number of, because they say he was overzealous. Mm-hmm.
Well, yes, but I don't know if that's a legitimate criticism. I think each prosecutor has his or her style, and Fatou Bensouda's style is a different one from former prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo. And I think what we need to remember is that the prosecutor is mandated to follow the evidence, and that is all he or she can do. And that's what Ms. Bensouda is currently doing.
The other issue, I seem to remember, it would seem to me, Ottilia, that Sudan signed the Rome Statute in 2000, in September of 2000. But in August of 2008, after the indictment was served on President al-Bashir, they sent a communique to the Secretary General through the Foreign Minister Deng Al-Akul asking for the withdrawal of Sudan from the ICC. What's happened to that? Is it as simple as that?
So, unlike South Africa, which is a state party to the Rome Statute, Sudan never ratified the Rome Statute, so it was never a state party. So the process there is simply unsigning the Rome Statute and communicating to that effect. There's a difference where a country has now signed and also ratified, because ratification is what makes a state a member state to the Rome Statute, which Sudan never was.
Now that we've mentioned that, what makes that different from what the Americans have done? Because I understand President Clinton did sign the Rome Statute, but the Congress had not ratified the Rome Statute, and that is why charges cannot be brought against America. Why then bring charges against Sudan?
The difference is that for non-states parties, be it the United States, be it Sudan, in order for the matter to go before the ICC, it must go through the United Nations Security Council. It's the UN Security Council that refers the matter then to the ICC for consideration. Interestingly, when Sudan was referred to the ICC, the United States chose to abstain from voting rather than voting against the referral. However, it did vote for the referral of Libya in 2011. Sudan, not being a permanent member, no having successfully lobbied against its own referral, was referred successfully in 2005.
Angela, many people have leveled this accusation against the ICC that it targets African leaders to the exclusion of the Europeans. But I seem to remember there were two other cases after the Yugoslavia war where leaders from Yugoslavia were tried. The other case is still on as we speak.
Yes, and they were tried in the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, which is
What's the difference between the two?
Once again, that is a hybrid court, so it is different from the ICC. It's limited in terms of the scope of its investigations. It's limited in terms of its jurisdiction in time and place, and also, once its mandate is finished, it will dissolve or dissipate. The International Criminal Court is a permanent court and a permanent mechanism. So that's the primary difference between those two procedures. Surely,
then, if those courts, they fall under the jurisdiction of the ICC, isn't it?
No, they don't. They're hybrid courts, yes. They're hybrid courts. The United Nations
Probably you should explain to me what this hybrid court system thing means.
So they're hybrid courts in the sense that the United Nations is primarily involved in the construction and the sort of organization of those courts, as we see with the Hussein Habre trial as well, which is a hybrid court. And in this case, we see the AU, the United Nations, and Chad and Senegal participating. So hybrid courts take on a different form and have different players involved.
Thank you very much for that. If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can please still call us on 714-5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Rights and Recourse or email us on rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Your World makes it its business every evening to round up the leading local stories and international news to keep you informed all the time.
Make a date with Your World every evening for all the news headlines around the world to keep you abreast with knowledge.
Catch Your World for headlines across the world every Monday to Friday from 9 p.m, then Saturday and Sunday from 7 p.m.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse. So, Tilia, I want to come back to you with something that I found extraordinary, that after the indictment was served on on President al-Bashir, the AU met in Sirte in Libya and requested a meeting between the Ministers of Justice and Foreign Affairs to discuss several issues, including but not limited to immunities and privileges. What happened to this request?
So the first thing around the July 2009 extraordinary summit in Sirte was that there was a resolution from the AU that African Union member states should not cooperate with the ICC in respect of indictments of heads of state. Now, because this in many ways goes against Article 27 of the Rome Statute, which takes away that immunity, in many ways it would undermine what the Rome Statute is meant to do, which is target, or not so much target, but rather which is to indict individuals, no matter who they are, for crimes committed within their countries or elsewhere.
Do member states of the AU take the AU seriously? Because we've seen recently the AU issued a statement that heads of state should limit their stay in power to two terms. But we have seen a string of countries doing referenda and leaders wanting to stay on for another term. And also the chairman of the AU making the statement that they'll have to reverse that decision.
I think it's a good question as to whether member states of the AU take the AU seriously, because if you look at the AU Constitutive Act, it talks about accountability and justice. But then you see the AU saying that current heads of state shouldn't be standing trial. So I think within themselves, when they look at their Constitutive Act and their founding documents versus what they propose now, I think there are some contradictions there. As to whether their own member states take them seriously, I mean, we see Botswana has been very resolute in support for the ICC and cooperation with the ICC versus the AU that's called for non-cooperation essentially with the ICC. So I think we have to look at it on a state-by-state basis, and we have to remember that I think those nations that prioritize justice and accountability will act accordingly.
Similarly, Ottilia, we have seen African countries, we now see many elections taking place in Africa, and people say they are democratic. I seem to believe, I was taught that democracy is more than just elections every 5 years.
Indeed, elections are only a small component of what democracy really means. Democracy, well, quite simply, is meant to be, a rule of the people, by the people, and for the people. And while elections allow for individuals to be elected to serve the interests of the people, the proof of the pudding is really in the tasting, and the tasting is in the years between elections, where the government is meant to be serving the interests of the people. And what we've seen over the past year in Burundi, in Burkina Faso, is that this is not always the case, that the interests of the people are met nor promoted by their very governments.
The other question relating to the al-Bashir issue and also the issue of President Uhuru Kenyatta and Deputy President William Ruto, there was this issue of the AU then turned around in 2013 and set a contact group of 5 members to undertake consultations with the United Nations Security Council, in particular the 5 permanent members, with a view to engage them on all AU concerns on its relationship with the ICC. Should the UN accede to this view? Is South Africa not in danger of putting the cart before the horses?
They can, and they can discuss, on a political level, the African Union and the UN Security Council. However, at the end of the day, when it comes to issues related to the operation of the court itself, it's somewhat remiss for the African Union to allege that the court is being politicized and then calling for more political talks, because then what they're doing is saying that the ICC should not be politicized by anyone other than ourselves, and that's inherently problematic.
The other question I want to go to is that there's been the criticism of funding of the court. Does it make a difference who funds the court that fights human rights for human rights?
The ICC is funded through member states only. So countries that have ratified the Rome Statute are meant to fund the court. Some countries make greater voluntary contributions to the ICC, countries like Japan and Canada. However, countries like the United States that are not member states of the Rome Statute do not fund the court. But on the same token, when one alleges that simply by being funded by a certain entity or country, therefore you have no independence, that same criticism can be leveled against the African Union that receives the majority of its funding from the European Union and its buildings from China.
Angela, the last minute we have quickly, probably I should leave that question for when we come back from the break. And if you'd like to join us, you can always join us on phoning us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rights Recourse, or email us on Rights and Recourse, and giving us your views on this program and many other programs that we are having here on Channel 404. Don't go away. We'll be back after the break.
Are you saying the king must go to jail? You are not royal blood, therefore you are going to serve time on behalf of the king. Where does the public protector stand on this matter? Are you with the marches, for the marches, against the march? If this is your ancestor, it is very much his ancestor as well, because this is the cradle of humankind. Is there God somewhere in your science? Drinking the blood of a person with albinism gives extra magical powers. A man of the cloth is involved here, because it would mean that somehow religion is being brought into this part of the myth. What do you say to me?
Watch Question Time with me, Mpho Tsedu, Monday to Thursday at 5:30 p.m. on the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back, and before we go into our discussion, let's take this call from Joe from Johannesburg. Joe, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Yes, good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Good, man. I just want any of the whoever is in the studio with you to answer a few questions to me, either Otiria or Angela. They seem to be knowledgeable, but I'm getting a problem here. Do any of you think international law is really law? It lacks uniformity, in my opinion, here. We don't see it applying at the same level. Why should I choose that a law should apply to me, and then someone else chooses that it should not apply to them? Isn't there a perfect dichotomy in your opinion? Number two, someone mentioned that in order for you to apply, to make it efficacious, it must go through the ICC. But then at the same time, some things are done, some matters are handled without the approval of the other side. So if we have to go through the ICC to do something, and then we are having a problem here, all right? You can be, I think I don't see fairness right here. If the law applies to others while it does not apply to the rest,
I think
it's not right. Look at Europe. It's like it was meant to attack African leaders or Africa and possibly Eastern Europe. And we see the West is jumping out of it all the time.
I think, Joey, we get a gist of your question. I think it's something we've been seized with here, this issue of the Americans who do not want to adhere to the United Nations conventions, like the United Nations Security Council at some stage, or the ICC. And Joe was asking, why should other people be expected to die or leave by these organizations when some people don't want?
I think what's important to remember here is the victims, and that the international criminal justice system is designed to serve the victims. If anyone can tell me that there are no victims in these African situations that are being investigated, I will rest my case. But there are countless victims, and they require justice. And also, if we look at our continent and our own national jurisdictions, we don't often have the correct legislative framework to deal with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. We don't have regional bodies that have criminal jurisdiction. And so the International Criminal Court is the only option. And if victims and providing justice for the victims
Angela, we've seen the court in Senegal, in Dakar, Senegal, that is trying Hissène Habré.
That has taken 20 hard years to establish and has been driven primarily by the victims and certain civil society organizations. And that is a remarkable example. But whether that is sustainable and implementable in different situations is another question. I am first and foremost, I think justice at the national level is a priority and very important. But failure currently to do that means we have to look to the ICC.
Ottilia, the African Court of Human and People's Rights was established in 1998, but as of September 2014, only 27 countries had ratified the protocol establishing the country. It goes back to a question that I asked earlier: do member states of the AU take the AU seriously?
I'll give you an additional statistic. Of those 27, only 7 countries have made a declaration known as an Article 34.6 declaration, allowing normal citizens, myself and yourself, to have direct access to the African court. So only 7 African countries have seen it fit to allow for citizens to be able to bring matters to the African court. Everyone else must go a roundabout way to approach the court. And so when we speak about being committed to justice, be it continental justice or international justice, there are important questions that need to be raised, and I think you rightly raise it, whether they are committed not just to the African Union as a political body, but also of the institutions established to promote the principles of the African Union. And so far, 27 African countries have ratified the African Court Protocol. At the same time, 34 African countries have ratified the ICC.
Let's take this call from Vilakazi from Johannesburg. This is our last call for today. Vilakazi, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Hey, good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Good, good. No, I just wanted to ask one question because Angela is very vocal that al-Bashir is actually arrested because of human rights violations and stuff like that. But the point is, at the moment in Sudan, there's a bit of a calm in Sudan, and the AU is busy trying to resolve the situation that is taking place in Sudan. Now, my question is, if al-Bashir gets arrested, because remember again that al-Bashir has been voted in by the people of Sudan. Now, if al-Bashir gets arrested, is that not going to exacerbate war again in Sudan when we see that there's peace coming forward in Sudan? That's my question.
Thank you very much, Vilakazi. I don't know, I think you heard that question that was directed specifically to you. They say you are vocal, you want al-Bashir to be arrested. And yet, if he is arrested, there's going to be instability in Darfur and in Sudan.
The same suggestion was made when there was talk of arresting Charles Taylor, and Charles Taylor was successfully apprehended and it was fine. I think people need to appreciate the bigger picture, which is that there can be no peace and stability without justice and accountability. And as we speak, atrocities continue in Darfur, Sudan. And that is because President Omar al-Bashir is still involved and still in charge of that country. And I think once we prioritize the correct things, we can then ensure peace and stability take place. But as it is now, there is no chance that there'll be peace and stability in that region.
Ladies, thank you very much. You want to quickly in 30 seconds.
Yes, I will. One of the key issues and challenges is that making peace rest on one individual will always be problematic. But also at the same time, the African Union, through its high-level panel on Darfur that the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, led, made recommendations in 2009 geared towards peace and justice. Those have not been addressed and those have not been responded to, and al-Bashir remains president.
Well, thank you very much, ladies, for your input in today's program. It's been a very riveting program here on the ICC. We hope we're going to have many of these kind of discussions, and it looks like we still have a long way to go in meeting our obligations as Africans in terms of justice. This has been Right and Recourse. This program is repeated at 5 on Monday morning. Do find us on Twitter and on YouTube. From all of us here in the studio and the rest of the team, thank you to our guests and good afternoon.